In this video, I'm going to show you how I made two mallets, which I fondly refer to as my instruments of persuasion. They're probably just going to be decorative and get hung up in the garage, despite my best attempts to convince my wife that they belong on the fireplace mantle. She disagreed and didn't understand why I'd make hammers I'm not going to use, and then I received the look for asking her the same question about the throw pillows. For this project I used leftover sapele and hard maple from the serving tray I built, and everything was already mostly milled. I jointed one face of the sapele, lopped off what I needed at the table saw, and resawed that piece twice at the bandsaw to get workable pieces to form the heads of the mallets. All my dimensions are loosely based on the shop notes issue number 2, Joiner's Mallet plans. I did make some adjustments, including increasing the size of the mallet head, so these were planed to 3/4 of an inch thick. And then I took a little break. What did you find?
A little pony.
What's he doing?
He's crawling.
After observing the adventures of Mr. Roly-Poly, or Miss, I'm really not sure how to tell, I cut the sapele pieces to 3 inches wide and set them aside to begin working on what would be the middle of the mallet heads. Unfortunately, I didn't have a piece of maple 3 inches wide, so I had to make one wide enough. I got a straight edge at the table saw, used that as a reference to resaw, and then planed it down to 1 inch thick. This would make the final width of the mallet heads come out to 2.5 inches. So I cut this maple in half and glued the two halves together to make a piece tall enough for the size of the mallet head that I was making. After the glue dried, I trimmed the block down a little bit and set my miter fence to 2 degrees. The 2-degree taper is for the wedge tenons that will ensure the mallet head doesn't come flying off the handle, which, in case you didn't know, is the origin of that phrase. Next, I cut my sapele pieces to width and glued half the mallet head together. I made this 1 inch wide spacer you see off to the right that has both sides cut at 2 degrees to help arrange the maple sides properly while gluing everything together. I then used a piece of scrap plywood to ensure everything was aligned properly again while I tightened up my clamp. Once that was firmly clamped to my workbench, I removed the little spacer block and wiped up any excess glue. Turns out I didn't quite have enough in that 3-inch wide maple block I made, so I had to make another from some scrap. Then I repeated the same process with my spacer to glue together the second mallet head. While that dried, I began working on the handles. First, I ripped them to be 1.5 inches by 1.25 inches. Then I tagged in my dado blade and started chewing through these cuts to form the tenons on which the head fits. I had to set the height of the dado blade differently for 2 of the sides because the handle piece was not square. Then I cleaned up the edges with a chisel and moved on to cutting slots in the tenons for the wedged tenons to fit into. I find this to be easier at the bandsaw rather than the table saw, even though I do have a Delta tenoning jig, but it's old and covered in rust and needs to be restored. Maybe that's another video for another day. I drilled holes in the bottom of the tenons on the handle as an insurance policy against the tenons splitting when I drive the wedges in. After that, I threw the handles in the vise and sanded the bandsaw marks in between the tenons so the wedges would go in a little bit easier. I went back to working on the mallet heads, one of which needed a little sanding so that when I glued the other piece of sapele to it, it would sit flush up against the maple. My workbench is not flat, so I did this on a granite surface plate and then let the glue flow. After the glue was dry, I unwrapped everything and planed off some of the glue that had dried on the underside of the mallet head with a block plane. I ran the heads over a jointer a couple of times as well to make sure that the bottom was flat and would sit flush against the lip of the handles. I then cut the protruding maple off the top and jointed the tops as well. I set the miter fence back at 2 degrees and fleshed up the ends. Final dimensions of each head was 3 inches tall, 2.5 inches wide, and 5 3/4 inches long. I went back to working on the handles and used the template I made from my serving tray video to mark the curves. Onto the bandsaw I went to cut out the rough curve of the handles. After I cut the first 2 sides, I taped the excess back onto the handle so I could follow the outline for the other 2 sides. I used a spoke shave to break the corners and round things over because that seemed like more fun than sanding. This was when I was struck with a moment of design inspiration. I didn't plan to do this originally, but I thought it would be cool if I put some inlays in the top of the handles. So I set the miter fence to 66 degrees and cut 3 grooves in the handle, each 1/2 inch apart. Then I turned around the miter fence and made matching cuts on the opposite side. Next, I sliced off a few strips of sapele for the inlays, sanded them so that they fit into the grooves just right, and then glued them into the handles. Once dried, I carefully trimmed off the inlay that was sticking out of the side of the handles, and then used a block plane to shave down the rest. For the final work, I used a chisel to get the inlay flush with the rest of the handles. I set the miter fence to match the angle I used for the inlays and cut the handles to their final length. Then came the sanding to remove all of the bandsaw marks and get the final shape. And lastly for the handles was to trim the tenons, which I purposefully left too tall up until this point. For the last time I went back to working on the mallet heads, where I added a chamfer with a block plane all the way around for one, and the other I did a 3/8 inch roundover. The one with the roundover needed some extra sanding to get rid of some burn marks too. In order to forge the one bottle opener to rule them all, I drilled a couple of holes in the end of one of the mallet heads to accept the opener hardware. With my table saw blade set to 2 degrees, I used a clamp and some double-sided tape to stick this sapele to some plywood and create the wedges for my wedged tenon. I did a final sanding with 220 grit sandpaper and started gluing it all together. I put some glue on the tenon of the handle and used my God-given glue spreader to distribute it evenly, and then inserted the handle into the mallet head. I dropped some glue down into the tenon for good measure, smothered my wedges with glue, and drove them home, which was by far the most satisfying part of this project. Okay, into the home stretch now. I trimmed off the top, leaving some hanging out, and used a glue sawdust mixture to fill a couple of gaps, and then it was on to finishing. I used Danish oil for the finish, which went on very nicely. The end grain soaked up a ton, which I wiped on probably close to 8 times before it was saturated. It was now time to take a moment and enjoy my creation with an ice cold, refreshing root beer.